This is the story of an American family. It will focus on 3 unforgettable years of David Sakamoto's childhood when America was involved in World War II. The story begins in 1898 when David's grandfather immigrated to America from a small island in Japan to Hawaii, where he worked in the sugar plantations. From Hawaii, he arrived in San Francisco in 1906, just 2 weeks after the big earthquake. By 1910, he had made his way to Seattle. David's grandparents were married in 1911. David's aunt was born in 1912, and the following year, in 1913, David's mother was born in Seattle, Washington. She was a Nisei, second generation, born in the U.S. His grandparents moved to Toppenish in 1917 to work at the Washington Nursery. The family lived across the road from Grandma Ward, who was half Yakima Indian. David's father was a merchant marine in the Japanese Navy, and in 1927 arrived in Astoria, Oregon. He came to Wapato, where he farmed on land that is now the site of Wapato Middle School. David's parents met and married in 1932 at the Buddhist church in Wapato. David was born in Toppenish in 1935, the second of 8 children. By 1940, David's grandmother and his uncles had moved to Wapato following the passing of David's grandfather. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and overnight, America was plunged in a world war. David was 7 years old. Suddenly, American citizens of Japanese descent were looked upon with suspicion and fear because they looked like the people who had bombed Pearl Harbor. Under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt on February 1942 and carried out by the Western Defense Command and the 4th Army Control Administration, Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were rounded up and detained. An exclusion zone was established. This was a specific geographic area where certain activities were prohibited. In this case, these were geographic areas where persons of Japanese ancestry were not allowed to reside. The original exclusion areas from the West Coast up to the Cascade Mountain Range, which did not include Kittitas and Yakima counties. However, in May of 1942, when Civilian Exclusion Order 98 was issued, the area included Kittitas, Klickitat, Benton, Yakima, and parts of Chelan and Okanagan counties. All persons of Japanese ancestry in this area were rounded up and incarcerated in one of the 10 internment camps located in remote areas of America.
I remember I was 7 years old. My brother's sister, my mom and dad and grandma and uncles were ordered into an internment camp during World War II. I should start with my father, being an undocumented alien, was picked up by the FBI in early February of 1942. They came in the middle of the night. My mother told me my grandmother had gone to the outhouse, and when she was coming out, the FBI agents told the FBI agents, "Don't touch her. She's got papers." My father was taken from the farm to the Yakima County Jail on an immigration hold for almost 100 days. My Uncle Toma, who was 21 at the time, and my mom visited him periodically. During one of these visits in February, collectively, they decided that they would plant the crop for 1942 in March, with my dad in custody. At the time, we had leases on 2 80-acre parcels from the Yakima tribal nation. In April, my father was sent to an immigration camp in Fort Missoula, Montana. Then on May 27, the civilian exclusion order gave us 9 days to settle our affairs, relinquish our leases, find homes for our pets, and pack a few belongings that we could personally carry. Our home and just planted crops we had to leave behind. Fortunately, we had good neighbors. Mrs. Olden, who lived across the road from us, saved a lot of our household goods and put them in her basement. She and her son, Bobby, were the ones that took us to the train depot in Wapato. Before we left, Mrs. Olden gave my mother a sterling silver ring. She had cut the spoon end off and made a ring out of the stem with her family name on it. She gave it to my mom and told her, "Remember me while you are in internment." Before getting on the train, we had to tag our belongings with our family number, 33130. From Wapato, we left by train with the window shades drawn for blackout purposes. Our route was to Pasco and then down the Columbia River to Portland, to the Pacific Livestock Exposition Center, which was a temporary assembly center. When we arrived, our mom impressed upon us 3 older boys that we were in charge of taking care of our little sister, who was only 3 years old. We also needed to know where we lived. We lived in Section 4, Corner D, Apartment 30. This was maybe a 20 by 20 square foot with just plywood walls and a blanket for a doorway. So there was Mom, who was pregnant, and 5 of us kids. Next door lived Grandma Cooney and my 3 uncles, Toma, Dick, and Wayne. We went to a mess hall to eat. I don't know how many shifts they had for mess, but it seems like there was thousands of people in the center. We were there from June until the end of August, when we boarded a train to Heart Mountain, an internment camp outside of Cody, Wyoming. We went through Spokane, across the Rockies to Fort Missoula, Montana, a former cavalry post dating from the 1870s. The train stopped briefly, and my mom was allowed to talk with my dad on the train platform. And we, all of us kids, peeked through the blackout curtains to see our parents. When we got to Heart Mountain, they were still building barracks for the people who were coming in. Our family was directed to Block 21, Barrack 10, Apartment C. We lived in C, and Grandma Cooney and our 3 uncles lived next door in Apartment D. My oldest uncle, Toma, was only there for 3 days. He figured out a way how to get out. There was milk delivery every day. And on the 3rd day, he hid on the milk truck and he was gone. He eventually ended up in Chicago. And on his way there, he said he washed a lot of dishes in a lot of different restaurants. In October of that year, 1942, my younger brother Ron Kengo was born. And the three of us boys started school. My younger brother Ray was in the first grade. I was in the second grade, and my older brother Ben was in the third grade. The barracks were split 12 on each side, and there were about 8 or 9 of us kids would walk up to block 15 to go to school. The classrooms were very small since they were still building some of the barracks. By the next year, we went to school in block 28, and the classrooms were much larger. By then, it was less chaotic, and the construction of the barracks were pretty well finished up. After things got settled down in camp, people started various enterprises. Mr. Yoshida, who was from Seattle, lived in block 15. And in his barracks, he started his own grocery business. It was mostly dry goods. How we got him into the relocation center, I have no idea. One of our activities was to ride on the coal truck with our neighbor, Ben Nishimoto, who would deliver coal to all the boiler rooms. The cab was big enough so 3 kids could ride in it. Somehow or another, we worked out a rotation where all the neighborhood kids got to ride in the truck. One of the things that we had to do in the wintertime was to get coal for our pot-bellied stove, our only heat source. When Ben Nishimoto would deliver coal to our boiler room, we knew we had to go. It was time to go home and get the coal bucket for the nice big chunks of coal. And it was a 2-kid job. In March of 1943, 13 months after my dad got picked up by the FBI, my mother had petitioned the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, to let my dad come from Fort Missoula to Hart Mountain. Soon after that, my dad arrived in the camp with several documents, including his travel permit. I remember Mom making one of his favorite dinners, which was unagi donburi, canned eel over rice and seaweed, the ingredients which we had to get from Mr. Yoshida's grocery store. My dad was skilled as a carpenter, so he got a foreman position in the carpenter shop. He was paid $19 a month. The regular guys were paid only $16. He also drove the shop truck so he could pick the guys up for work and then drop them off at night. One of the things I remember was in the wintertime, it snowed quite a bit up there. It was high mountain desert. And there was this one particular hill that had a watchtower on it. We would go sliding down the hill with sleds that our uncles made out of hardwood that we got from Dad's carpenter shop. This was good wood, and they made steering mechanisms for us. I remember we had contests sledding down the hill, one for distance and one for speed. We had contests with these kids that lived in Block 8 that were from East LA. They put tin strips on the bottoms of their sleds. It must have slowed them down, because I guess they didn't know too much about snow. because we beat them every time. I think it was that year my dad bought one of those cobbler kits made out of cast iron for repairing shoes. Because during the war, shoes were rationed. And he had access to used rubber tires, so he would trace out patterns of the soles and then put them onto our shoes. The following April of 1944, my sister Elaine Fumie was born. Then in that summer, it must have been in August, the school was out. My uncle Nita and his daughter Yoshi, who was about my age, arrived with a truck from their farm in eastern Oregon. Grandma Cooney and Uncle Dick and Uncle Wayne put their belongings on the truck and moved to Oregon. I guess if you had a place to go, you could leave, but it had to be somewhere that was not in the exclusion zone. There was only a door separating our apartments, so we spread out into Grandma's apartment, so we had more space for all of us kids. At that time in 1944, there was a prisoner of war exchange. Because of my dad's status, there was talk that our family might be sent to Tule Lake Segregation Center in California. But somehow or another, our family was not a real high priority, and so it got shelved. My sister Arlene Kazue was born in April of 1945. And in August or September, there was another deportation scare for our family. But nothing happened. From around September, this was after the war was over, people started leaving the internment camp. Depending on what kind of arrangements you had. There were families that had land, so they were the first ones that were able to leave because they had a place to go. My dad's immigration status, being what it was, we did not leave until the next to the last train that left Heart Mountain, which was November 5th of 1945. The train brought us back to Wapato, and we stayed in what we call the Kaikan, a gym and meeting hall right next to the Buddhist church, for about 3 weeks. My mom talked with the director of War Relocation Authority, Miss Pete, who was in charge of housing and transportation for the returning families. She was a Methodist minister who had been a missionary in China before the war. She was instrumental in getting my dad a job with the Longernecker family, who had a beekeeping operation just west of Wapato. I guess he fixed hives and made frames for the honeybees. One of the first things that Miss Pete arranged with Mom was school for us in Toppenish, because that's where we were going to live. We rode the Northwestern Stage Company bus from Wapato to the Toppenish Library, and then we walked a couple blocks south to the Garfield Grade School. My brother Ray was in the 4th grade. I was in the 5th grade, and my older brother, Ben, was in the 6th grade. My sister Carolyn was supposed to start the 1st grade, but the principal thought, since we had missed September, October and half of November, that it would be better to hold her back until next year. And she was really disappointed. But she was later able to skip the 3rd grade, so she got caught up. We moved into a house on the Ward property outside of Toppage. My mom had an agreement with Grandma Ward, who was half Yakima. You see, she had been next door neighbor with Grandpa and Grandma way back in 1917 when they came to work for the Washington Nursery. Her son, Chick, raised alfalfa, grain, and milked about 30 head of cows. Grandma Ward leased our family 20 acres of her 80-acre allotment for the crop years of 1946 and 1947. I recall the Ward family gave us a 1930 Chevrolet single-axle truck to drive. Their neighbor, Jack Finley, kept it in good running condition. He even installed seal beam headlights, which was special in those days. By the fall of 1947, our family was able to lease an 80-acre parcel on Olden Way and Branch Road, right next to the original 80 acres we farmed 6 years earlier before we were ordered to leave the valley.
Over 1,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced to leave on a train from the Yakima Valley, and only a very small percentage chose to return to the valley, primarily to the Wapato area. David Sakamoto's story is one of many such stories. It was estimated that 9,000 acres worth of crops were lost as a result of the internment. The former thriving Yakima's Japantown business district never recovered. None of the Japanese business owners returned to reopen their businesses. Tonight, on the eve of the 76th anniversary of the events leading to World War II and the internment of Japanese Americans, let's take a moment and reflect on the impact on our businesses, our schools, our elected officials, the arts, our celebrations, and cultural events in our community, our city, and our county if this internment had never happened.